Snacking, we'll call that junk food. That'll work. Movies? Nope. All right. Well, go ahead, Clayton. They have 3 mistakes. We'll show them the results here. The next slide, the only ones you missed were soft drinks, texting, and gossiping. So you did fairly well, I would say. How many of you are giving up something for Lent this year? All right. Not too many. But that's all right. This is kind of a Catholic thing anyway. So, in fact, I did go to a Catholic website which explained why they do that, and I think it's kind of helpful. It says, in Lent we acknowledge the ways we have turned away from God in our lives, and we focus on turning our hearts and minds back toward Him. Hence, the 3 pillars of Lent are praying, fasting, and almsgiving. And these observances help us turn away from whatever has distracted or derailed us and to turn back to God. Giving up something for Lent is ultimately a form of fasting, and we can deprive ourselves of some small pleasure or indulgence and offer that sacrifice up to God. Or we might give up a bad habit, such as smoking, as a way of positively turning our life back towards what God wants for us. So not a bad thing to do during Lent as we are walking and as we're heading our way towards Easter. But I have a suggestion. I have a suggestion of something that we should be willing to give up for Lent. You know what that is? Your life. Yikes. Sounds like a really good outreach program, right? But that is what our reading today suggests. If we go and look at our reading, it says, for whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel's will save it. Whoever loses or is willing to give up their life, and we're talking not just for Lent here, but for always, will be saved. And this is a very challenging verse. Now, there are 2 different ways you could interpret this, and both, I would say, would be correct. We talk about killing off the old Adam, or dying to self. So we could speak of this killing or dying in a spiritual sense, and I think that would be a very appropriate way to interpret it. But I do think you can also interpret this in a literal sense. There is a verse in Matthew that says, do not fear those who kill the body, but cannot kill the soul. Rather, fear him who can destroy both body and soul and body in hell. And that implies is we should not fear death, people that can harm the body, because our eternal destiny is much more important than saving our life. And as we just had our installation here, I think you heard, and it shocks me every time I hear it, that are you willing to even go to death itself in your defense of what you believe? And that is our challenge, and it's a scary thought, and I think especially a scary thought when we consider how ISIS is growing in influence, and what are just the unbelievable things that they are doing to young Christian children in various parts of the world. And so this is a very challenging verse for us today. But as we contemplate the challenge, we also realize that we have a very good example to follow. Like any good leader, Jesus won't ask anything of us that he wouldn't be willing to do himself. And that he did. Jesus was willing to give up his life. In fact, he tells his disciples today that is what's going to happen. And what did the disciples do? They kind of freaked out a little bit. What? Maybe the same reaction that you had when I suggested giving your life up for Lent. I think we can all imagine Peter walking over to Jesus and putting his arm around him and taking him aside and then to begin to straighten Jesus out about what this Messiahship is all about. But Jesus gets after Peter for his short-sightedness. He has blurry vision. Jesus calls him Satan. Even though he's not Satan, he is at least doing the work of Satan. No, Peter, don't tempt Jesus in this way. He has to do this. He has to because, number one, it's the will of his Father. Number two, it was the main reason that he came down to earth. And number three, because he loves you. But Jesus didn't stop there. He didn't stop at the idea that Jesus, must give his life up to suffer and to die a gruesome death on an instrument of torture, much worse than our electric chair today. He also went on to tell the disciples that they also must take up their cross and follow him. I suppose if we were to look at the reaction of Peter and the apostles and were to put it into a language that we might say today, we could say that maybe the apostles said this. They said, "This is not what I signed up for." Jesus understands that they are still learning about who he is and what he came to do. In fact, he starts out the conversation today by asking, well, who do people say that I am? And they gave various responses. And then finally, Jesus makes it very personal. Who do you say that I am? And Peter says, you are the Christ, which means Peter understood that he was the Messiah. That is the one who was to come to bring salvation and to restore the kingdom. But it also became clear very quickly that the apostles' idea of messiahship and kingship and kingdom was completely different than Jesus' idea for that. Verse 31 says, "And he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes and be killed, and after 3 days rise again." Now this word, Son of Man, that language actually comes from the book of Daniel. And in the book of Daniel, it refers to a heavenly figure who is given a dominion and kingship over all peoples, a very triumphant and strong figure. However, this linking of the Son of Man with the word suffering in the same sentence was a new concept for these people. At the mention of suffering, rejection, and death, all listening ceases. In fact, they never heard that last verse where it says, "Rise again." They never got that far. They were already derailed and focused on and hung up on the suffering and the dying. But the point of Jesus' whole discussion is I am not what you think I am. Yes, I'm the Messiah, but the Messiah is not quite the way you think it is. I am not about conquering the world through military might. My kingdom is not of this world. As the Messiah, I come as a servant to suffer and to die for my people. Now, in hindsight, it's easy for us to look back and to see what Jesus is saying, to put it all together and to understand. And we all know hindsight is 20/20. But surprisingly, even with hindsight, not everybody necessarily gets it today. Martin Luther has what he describes as a theology of those who haven't quite yet got it. And that theology was what called the theology of glory. The theology of glory is a theology which projects an image of Christ as to how the world would expect him to look like, how a world would expect a God to look like. But those who get it would understand what Luther calls the theology of the cross. The theology of the cross is grounded in God's self-revelation in the weakness and the suffering and death of Jesus Christ. The theology of glory confirms what people want in a God. The theology of the cross contradicts everything that people could imagine.